She's a pretty girl, Owen said grudgingly of Lunette. But girls live with warriors for one reason only, boy, to get rich. So make sure you keep her happy, for sure as eggs she'll make you miserable. He fished in his coat's pockets and found a small gold ring. Give it to her, he said. I stammered my thanks. Warrior leaders were supposed to grant their followers gifts, yet even so, the ring was a generous gift, for I had yet to fight as one of Owain's men. Lunette liked the ring, which, with the silver wire I had unwrapped from my sword's pommel, was the beginning of her treasure hoard. She incised a cross on the ring's worn surface, not because she was a Christian, but because the cross made it into a lover's ring, and showed that she had passed from girlhood into womanhood. Some men also wore lovers' rings, but I craved after the simple iron hoops that victorious warriors hammered from the spearheads of their defeated enemies. Owain wore a score of such rings in his beard, and his fingers were dark with others. Arthur, I'd noticed, wore none. Once our own harvest was gathered from the fields around Kirkadern, we marched all over Dumnonia to collect the tax crops. We visited client kings and chiefs, and were always accompanied by a clerk from Mordred's treasury, who tallied the revenue. It was strange to think that Mordred was now king, and that it was no longer Uther's treasury we filled. But even a baby king needed money to pay for Arthur's troops, as well as all the other soldiers who were keeping Dumnonia's borders secure. Some of Owain's men were sent to reinforce the permanent guard in Geraint's frontier fortress at Duro Cobrivis, while the rest of us became taxmen for a while. I was surprised that Owain, that famous lover of battle, did not go to Duro Cobrivis, nor back to Gwent, but instead stayed with the commonplace work of assessing tax. To me, such work seemed menial, but I was just a wispy-bearded boy who did not understand Owain's mind. Tax, to Owain, was more important than any Saxon. Taxes, as I was to learn, were the best source of wealth for men who did not want to work. And this tax season, now that Uther was dead, was Owain's opportunity. At hall after hall he reported a bad harvest, and thus levied a low tax payment, and all the while he was lining his own purse with the bribes offered in return for making just such a false report. He was quite guileless about it. "Uther would never have let me get away with it," he told me one day, as we walked along the southern coast towards the Roman town of Isker. He spoke fondly of the dead king. "Uther was a fly old bastard, and always had a shrewd idea of what he should get. But what does Mordred know?" He looked to his left. We were crossing a wide, bare heath atop a great hill, and the view to the south was of the glittering empty sea, where a wind blew strong to fleck the grey waves white. Way off to the east, where a long sweeping shingle bank ended, there was a mighty headland, on which the waves shattered into foam. The headland was almost an island, joined to the mainland only by a narrow causeway of stone and shingle. "Know what that is?" Owain asked me, jutting his chin towards the headland. "No, lord." "The Isle of the Dead," he said, then spat to ward off ill luck, while I stopped and stared at the awful place that was the seat of Dumnonian nightmares. The headland was the Isle of the Mad, the place where Pelennor belonged with all the other crazed and violent souls who were considered dead the moment they crossed the guarded causeway. The isle was under the guardianship of Crom Dubh, the dark, crippled god, and some men said that Croaken's cave, the mouth of the otherworld, lay at the isle's extremity. I stared at it in dread, until Owain clapped my shoulder. "You'll never need to worry about the Isle of the Dead, boy," he said. "You've got a rare head on your shoulders." He walked on westwards. "Where are we staying tonight?" he called to Llewellyn, the treasury clerk whose mule carried the year's falsified records. "With Prince Cadwy of Isca," Llewellyn answered. "Ah, Cadwy. I like Cadwy. What did we take from the ugly rogue last year?" Llewellyn did not need to look at his wooden tally sticks with their recording notches, but reeled off a list of hides, fleeces, slaves, tin ingots, dried fish, salt, and milled corn. "He paid most in gold, though," he added. "I like him even more," Owain said. "What will he settle for, Llewellyn?" Llewellyn estimated an amount half of what Cadwy had paid the previous year, and that was precisely the amount agreed before the evening meal in Prince Cadwy's hall. It was a grand place, built by the Romans, with a pillared portico that faced down a long wooded valley towards the sea reach of the River Exe. Cadwy was a prince of the Dumnonii, the tribe which had given our country its name, and Cadwy's princedom made him of the second rank in the kingdom. Kings were of the highest rank. Princes like Geraint and Cadwy, and client kings like Melwas of the Belgi came next, and after them were the chiefs like Merlin, though Merlin of Avalon was also a druid, which put him outside the hierarchy altogether. Cadwy was both a prince and a chief, and he ruled a sprawling tribe that inhabited all the land between Isca and the border of Cernau. There had been a time when all the tribes of Britain were separate, and a man of the Catuvellauni would look quite different from a man of the Belgi, but the Romans had left us all much alike. Only some tribes, like Cadwy's, still retained their distinct appearance. His tribe believed themselves to be superior to other Britons, in mark of which they tattooed their faces with the symbols of their tribe and sept. Each valley had its own sept, usually of no more than a dozen families. Rivalry between the septs was keen, but nothing compared to the rivalry between Prince Cadwy's tribe and the rest of Britain. The tribal capital was Isca, the Roman town, which had fine walls and stone buildings as great as any in Glevum, though Cadwy preferred to live outside the town on his own estate. Most of the townspeople followed Roman ways and eschewed tattoos, but beyond the walls, in the valleys of Cadwy's land, where Roman rule had never lain heavily, every man, woman, and child bore the blue tattoo marks on their cheeks. It was also a wealthy area, but Prince Cadwy had a mind to make it wealthier still. "Been on the moor lately?" he asked Owain that night. It was a warm, sweet night, and supper had been served on the open portico that faced Cadwy's estates. "Never," Owain said. Cadwy grunted. I had seen him at Uther's High Council, but this was my first chance to look closely at the man, whose responsibility was to guard Dumnonia against raids from Cernau or distant Ireland. The prince was a short, bald, middle-aged man, heavily built, with tribal marks on his cheeks, arms, and legs. He wore British dress, but liked his Roman villa with its paving and pillars and channeled water that ran in stone troughs through the central courtyard and out to the portico, where it made a small foot-washing pool, before running over a marble dam to join the stream further down the valley. Cadwy, I decided, had a good life. His crops were plentiful, his sheep and cows fat, and his many women happy. He was also far from the threat of Saxons, yet still he was discontented. "There's money on the moor," he told Owain. 10. 10? Owain sounded scornful. Cadwy nodded solemnly. He was fairly drunk, but so were most of the men around the low table on which the meal had been served. They were all warriors, either Cadwy's or Owain's men, though I, being junior, had to stand behind Owain's couch as his shield-bearer. 10, Cadwy said again. "And gold, maybe, but plenty of tin." Their conversation was private, for the meal was almost over, and Kudui had provided slave girls for the warriors. No one had any attention for the two leaders, except for me and Kudui's shield-holder, who was a dozy lad staring slack-jawed and dull-eyed at the slave girls' antics. I was listening to Owain and Kudui, but kept so still and straight that they probably forgot I was even standing there. "You may not want 10, Kudui said to Owain, "but there's plenty who do. Can't make bronze without tin, and they pay a fancy price for the stuff in Armorica, let alone up country." He jerked a dismissive fist towards the rest of Dumnonia, then gave a belch that seemed to surprise him. He calmed his belly with a draught of good wine, then frowned as though he could not remember what he'd been talking about. 10, he finally said, remembering. "So, tell me about it," Owain said. He was watching one of his men who had stripped a slave girl naked and was now smearing butter on her belly. "It isn't my 10, Kudui said forcefully. "Must be someone's," Owain said. "You want me to ask Llewellyn? He's a clever bastard when it comes to money and ownership." His man slapped the girl's belly hard, splattering butter all over the low table and causing a gust of laughter. The girl complained, but the man told her to be quiet and started scooping butter and pork grease onto the rest of her body. "The fact of the matter is," Kudui said forcefully, to get Owain's attention off the naked girl, "that Uther let in a pack of men from Curnow. They came to work the old Roman mines because none of our people had the skills. The bastards are supposed, mark that, supposed to send their rent to your treasury. But the buggers are sending tin back to Curnow. I know that for a fact." Owain's ears had pricked up now. "Curnow? Making money off our land they are. Our land," Kudui said indignantly. Curnow was a separate kingdom, a mysterious place at the very end of Dumnonia's western peninsula that had never been ruled by the Romans. Most of the time it lived in peace with us, but every now and then King Mark would stir himself from his latest wife's bed and send a raiding party over the river Tamar. "What are men of Curnow doing here?" Owain asked, in a voice every bit as indignant as his host's. "I told you, stealing our money. And not just that. I've been missing good cattle, sheep, even a few slaves. Those miners are getting above themselves, and they're not paying you like they should. But you'll never prove it. Never. Not even your clever fellow Llewellyn can look at a hole in the moor and tell me how much tin is supposed to come out in a year." Kudui swiped at a moth, then shook his head moodily. "They think they're above the law. That's the problem. Just because Uther was their patron, they think they're above the law." Owain shrugged. His attention was back on the butter-smothered girl, who was now being chased about the lower terrace by a half-dozen drunken men. The grease on her body made her hard to catch, and the grotesque hunt was making some of the watching men helpless with laughter. I was having a hard time stopping myself from giggling. Owain looked back to Kudui. "So go up there and kill a few of the bastards, Lord Prince," he said, as though it was the easiest solution in the world. "I can't," Kudui said. "Why not?" "Uther gave them protection. If I attack them, they'll complain to the council and to King Mark, and I'll be forced to pay Sahid." Sahid was the blood price put on a man by law. A king's Sahid was unpayable. A slave's was cheap. But a good miner probably had a high enough price to hurt even a wealthy prince like Kudui. "So how will they know it's you who attacked them?" Owain asked scornfully. For answer, Kudui just tapped his cheek. The blue tattoos he was suggesting would betray his men. Owain nodded.